Rebecca is doing a Geochemical. So she is actually getting a degree both from Laurentian University and the University of Western Australia, where she's collaborating with a number of faculty down there. And with that, Becky, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. So I guess that's a good intro. Just to say that I'm in the third year of my PhD studies, and I'm working on one of the thematic projects. And I've been working pretty closely with the rest of the Wabigoonies, meaning the Dryden transect. That's what we call ourselves, the Wabigoonies, with Ben and Steph and the whole gang. And a lot of my work has been very collaborative. So for funding, because I'm co-tutel, I'm part of Metal Earth here and mainly based with LU. But my project also links into the Loop project based with the University of Western Australia. And that's trying to reinvent how we do 3D modeling so that it's more quantitative, but also more true to geological concepts and constraints. I have collaborations across Australia and also with the GSC in Ottawa, and heaps of software in-kind support from various vendors. A lot of what I do is Python programming, but also I utilize quite a few more advanced software. So thank you to my sponsors. My project has two main objectives. The one that I've spent the most time on recently has been to develop new system scale exploration techniques, mostly focusing on the front end, which we call feature engineering in a machine learning or prospectivity perspective. So I want to find ways to develop better inputs for all of our prospectivity and machine learning techniques. And to do that, I want to find ways that we can capture uncertainty in a quantitative way, reduce biases, especially when it's so early on in the stage of your workflow. You don't want to introduce subjectivity and bias throughout the whole workflow. You want to find quantitative methods and data-driven methods so that it's a more robust result. But in doing that, I also want to respect and stay true to all of the geological constraints and knowledge that we do have so that our results are geologically sensible. And that's a big link, is trying to get all the mathy, statsy stuff into the same room to talk with all of the geology stuff. And so that's where I focused most of my efforts until now. And then also using all of that information, leveraging all the results to investigate factors that control mineralization for Archean greenstone belts, which is the main goal, or one of the big goals for Metal Earth. So it's very well aligned with that. I have two study locations, and they were selected to be comparative so that I can really discuss and demonstrate what factors are being utilized or what are present in both or either of the areas. And the areas were selected because of their similar geologic histories, ages, and so on. Dryden, the greenstone belt there, is very similar and basically a cousin to Timmins, but they have contrasting gold endowment, and that's why. So for Dryden, we've done quite a lot of work in the last 3 years. Ben showed you some of it. And we've also developed a new geologic map for the area. So the constraints for that, we wanted to integrate every piece of data we could get our hands on, which took quite a while. As Sean said, it's the front end of cleaning up all the data to get something you can plug and play with is certainly a tall order. But we got there and we made this geologic map, and it was constrained based on our field observations. Not just myself, but we had collaboration with Ben, of course, and then 3 MSc studies, 3 BSc studies, and we've had some great conversations with other geologists working in the area. And we also utilize the reprocessed Aeromag grids, and as well as a big digitized and compiled database of maps, structures, and so on. And the main goal of making this map like this is because we wanted to make it internally consistent for a regional perspective. Make sure that all the faults are continuous, and you don't get little stubs of faults in the same frame as a giant big fault that's totally different scale And if you're going to do investigations, you want to make sure that all the features that are relevant are there, and you're not overcomplicating it with things that are not relevant to the question you're trying to ask of your data and of the geology. So here we did that for the scale. We also refined the boundaries for a lot of the large plutonic bodies. We added several early west trending shear zones, which you can see in the hash marks there. And they're marked by volumes rather than traces, to show the deformation extent, or at least the intense areas related to those deformation zones. And finally, we also defined some magnetically distinct layering from the aeromag. And that really shows some of the internal structure within the volcanic packages. For Timmins, we took pretty much the same approach. This was just based on one season of field work though, and it was during the COVID season, so it was a bit reduced. But I think the result was still really fantastic. And we actually added other data sets to help constrain the model, especially since Timmins is so covered by overburden. But we added drill core databases and reports from all of the mineral occurrences in the area. Updates to the map are here as well. And again, we focused on trying to make it internally consistent for this scale. So you can see the updates from the Discover Abitibi to this. And again, we wanted to make sure that all the faults were connected so that when we did go to make a 3D model of this area, we would have things that were continuous across the boundaries, and not just be choppy with border faults on map extents. So now that you've got a bit of a context for where I've been working and what I've been working with, the feature engineering part that I've started working on in the last 2 years, I started with structural complexity. Now, normally we take structural complexity maps from overlaying buffer zones around fault traces, fold traces, and so on, which are all interpreted layers that you send into an algorithm, and it quantifies or it calculates a buffer around each feature, and then you add all the grids together. But that is introducing subjectivity and bias very early on in your process. So is there a way that we can do this more quantitatively, just like what Sean was showing, to detect faults, but not just faults? I wanted to look at traps as well, so folds. And this is what I'm working on here, and it's in review. So for the methods, I have 2 inputs. I have bedding from the compiled data sets and new field observations, and I have the aeromagnetic grid. And from the aeromagnetic grid, we also do lineament extraction. And I use the dynamic range compression in Oasis Montage that was released as a result of work at the CET. And that's, again, just using a image processing technique. And then I also utilized PCI Geomatics Focus software to enhance that. So we took all of the lineaments, we chopped them up into segments, and we measured the trend of each segment. So with that and the bedding, I performed 2 calculations. The first is the circular variance. So how much all the structures within a search area of each part of the map vary. And just using bedding, strike, and aeromagnetic lineament trends, I measured that and then gridded it up. And then bedding, I wanted to see if I could get more by utilizing dip. So I calculated dispersion, which basically is looking at how much the normal vector to the bedding plane varies in orientation. So it's adding that 3D aspect to it. So all those results were interpolated, and then I validated by a comparison to current geological interpretations. And also I compared it using the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to make sure that it wasn't just a random result, that there was actually some significance within the data. So here I have a synthetic model made in Naughty, and you can see that there's high variance values along the folds and lows along the high strain zones. I wanted to make sure that before we get into real data, we can actually explain what we find in synthetic tests. And I think it did quite well. Here's some regional results. And I found that the bedding, while it has a higher resolution, it's very patchy in distribution in a spatial sense. So it didn't cover the whole map area, which was a challenge to make a lot of inferences when everything's so patchy. Although I did find that using dispersion did add high resolution results or better resolution results when you could zoom in and there was sufficiently dense data. But if you're going to do it at a regional sense, then you should probably be using aeromagnetics, using the lineaments from that. And using those results, I observed that there's high variance anomalies along fold axes. And then shear zones are marked by broad linear low variance anomalies, which you would expect because everything's parallel and been transposed. So everything would appear very similar in the magnetics. And then finally, fault traces are indicated mostly by offsetting anomalies or as structural boundaries, or boundaries anyway, between high and low variance anomalies themselves. And I'll get into some details and show you some really nice examples of that. So here for folds, some of the best examples here are in Dryden, and you can see for sure that there are definitely some high values along those fold traces. And by high, I mean that the variance is greater than 0.6, which is greater than 1 standard deviation away from the mean. We also have high variance in hinge zones of drag folds. And in Timmins, we have really great examples of fold interference, and we are getting high variance values as you would expect in a complex fold interference core. So that's really great. This red box is centered right on the town of Timmins and in the heart of the Timmins camp. For shear zones, you get broad linear low variance anomalies, like I said, and really fantastic results from both map areas, in fact, along the Porcupine Duster in Timmins and a few of the new east-west shear zones. It was really a nice surprise to see that there was so much co-location between these broad low anomalies in Dryden, because we interpreted all of these new shear zones going east-west, and then we see in these results that there is in fact an anomaly there. So it adds a little more confidence to our new interpretation after seeing this unbiased secondary data set. Also in Timmins, we extended the Pipestone fault as a hypothesis. We think it goes further west, and that's in one of the red boxes, the number 3 at the bottom there. We also see that the shear zones act as boundaries. So the very high variance anomaly to the south here in the red box is bounded by the shear zone, and then to the north you get a much lower anomaly. For late faults, like I said, you can see them offsetting various trends, and they also act as boundaries. And the fact that they're acting as boundaries is useful for 3D modeling, because when you want to divide up your space so that you can make models that are geologically reasonable and that your algorithms can understand and know where things are related, you really need to know where the end of your model should be, because models are not just made for a full block area. You want to chop it up reasonably based on lithotectonic domains. The link to gold is actually a pretty good result as well. I was surprised. Although this was intended to be a targeting tool, or at least a tool to discuss prospectivity and an input for that, it was interesting to see that a lot of the orogenic gold deposits are within 1,700 meters of high variance anomalies. So those anomalies that are greater than or equal to 1 standard deviation above the mean. And also, we get concentration of gold higher in the structurally complex zones. So those areas that are mostly structural traps, which is great. So in summary, this structural complexity work has been pretty useful, and it can be used for ground selection for future mapping. If you want to identify targets for exploration, it adds confidence to your geological interpretations, and it also has several really good implications for 3D modeling, which is part of my work with Loop. Other applications is that it can be used to characterize the subtle intrusive phases of plutonic bodies. There's industrial applications. We were working around some teams in the field looking at nuclear waste sites. And that is something that could be useful for them. And in fact, we have a master's student that is just finishing that she was doing something like that. It can also be used to fill gaps, especially the linear detection from the Aeromag and other data sets. That can be used in sparse structural measurement areas where there's lots of overburden or weathering, or it's just too difficult to do field work. It can highlight buried or unidentified intrusions as well. We found a lot of new dikes that are near or at surface that were unmapped before, and so we updated our maps based on that. And this should work with anything that has spatially continuous trends. If you can detect it and it's spatially consistent, you should be able to apply that. And that would work for DEM, seismic, gravity, and so on. So my second paper, I'm trying to generate another input type for prospectivity. And to do that, I wanted to find a way that we could be more quantitative about making maps that are proxies for favorable traps and sources. And so as I started on that journey, I realized that the baseline for that, namely how you interpret lithology based on chemistry with a lot of the traditional diagrams that are available, there's quite a disconnect, because many of these are developed for rocks that are not Archean, not like our rocks. So I'll just go over some of the issues that I came across and maybe some solutions that I've been working on. So problem one is that most of the traditional diagrams that we use to identify rock categories or lithology, they're based on rocks that were fresh, they're minerally altered, and it doesn't really apply to Archean rocks because they're commonly metasomatized. There's lots of mobility in the elements that are on the X and Y axes. And one of the best examples of that is Lemaitre's TAS, total alkali silica. And you can see on the X and Y, we have sodium, potassium, and silica, all very mobile in hydrothermal systems. And the samples I have here are plotted, and they come from the GeoRock database. And I've just grouped them into generalized compositional groups. And for the Archean, you do get a trend of purple ultramafic to yellow felsic, but it's a bit of a dog's breakfast where it goes all over the place. You have ultramafics appearing in felsic fields and vice versa, and you wouldn't confidently be able to draw a line and say, oh, this group is definitely felsic. Conversely, if you look at the modern data set, there's actually a pretty good discrimination between all of the different groups. There aren't a lot of ultramafics that plot, and they don't really have any proper home on this diagram. So that is a problem, but I'll show you some more on that later. So the fact that you're using mobile elements isn't great. This diagram was designed using 24,000 analyses, so statistically that's really great, especially for 1989. But again, the field boundaries were designed and defined based on fresh, modern volcanic rocks. So logically, you can't apply any Archean rocks to that because they've been metasomatized, because you also have intrusive rocks that you're going to want to classify. And finally, there's no high Mg rocks in their data set they use to constrain all of these fields. So that's not great for the Archean, where we have high Mg basalts and heaps of ultramafics that are very relevant in many exploration scenarios. So what I propose as a solution to that, and what I've been working on, is using least mobile elements, as many people do, and there are loads of different diagrams that are utilizing them. And then I want to also suggest that we use Archean rock samples themselves to define these fields, not just modern. Problem number two is that even if you're using least mobile elements, the ones that have been selected are not really optimized in a statistical sense. So they've generally been selected mostly based on expertise or knowledge, as well as trial and error of plotting one ratio against another, which is not to knock it. It's good. It's been helpful. but can we do better if we apply statistical tools? So here, Winchester and Floyd, they're using immobile elements, which is great. But you can see that there really isn't a great discrimination between all the different groupings. Everything's kind of plotting as a trend. There's no distinction between the different groups for either the Archean or the modern. And in fact, most of their field boundaries don't link up well with a lot of the lithology groups that we have reported. So issues with this is that it was defined using 300 analyses from 1977. So we've become much better at analyzing and getting results, but also there's a lot more samples we can use. And also, Winchester and Floyd reported that they made their field boundaries based on eyeball judgments, which is very subjective, especially if you're going to incorporate this into such an early part of your workflow. Again, you're introducing subjectivity far too early. Can you do better by using statistics? Pierce uses the same X and Y axes, but just extends the orders of magnitude by 2. And they base their diagram based on 8,000 analyses, and they define their fields more quantitatively using probability contours instead. And you do get better results, or a better coupling or co-location between the various litho groups and the fields. But it's still, it's a bit tricky. If you wanted to circle an area and say this is definitely this rock type, there would be an issue. As well, there isn't a great spot for the Archean ultramafics. They're just basically plotting on top of in the basalt field with all the mafic volcanics there. So that's an issue as well if you're going to apply this to an Archean setting. So I propose that we do use statistical tools to tell us what are the most statistically representative elements to make these diagrams, and then use our geosmarts to select from that subset what are the best ones relevant to whatever system we're trying to model. And that's what I've done. So for method, I selected a whole whack of least mobile elements. If they were populated well enough in the databases, then I selected them. From there, I performed principal component analysis, which basically, it characterizes the variance of your data cloud, and it defines what elements are going to characterize that variance the best. So you know which ones are going to break out those groups and be most definitive, and really get that separation, better than having everything plot on one another. And then from there, I'm doing k-means clustering to define within the population what lithologic groups are similar. And that, once they're interpreted, so all the clusters are labeled as mafic, ultramafic, and so on, use that as a guide on where to put field boundaries. So all of that is currently being written. I have results. I just need to write them up now. So that'll be hopefully presented at the next partners meeting next year. But as a little update on what I have coming out, I have 2 supplementary publications that will be co-submitted with my papers 1 and 2. So the first one, A, is all of the geological data that went into making my maps. And that will be submitted in data in brief and is currently in review. I also have a publication B with data in brief that will go as a co-submission with paper 2. And I've compiled roughly 28,000 samples from across the Western Abitibi and Western Wabigoon. And so it's a pretty big database, and I use that to do most of my interrogation for designing these different diagrams. And then paper 1, as I said, is currently in review, and I have it submitted with tectonophysics, the geochem targeting. So I have taken it, the whole geochemical stuff, a little bit further, and I've really looked at implications for mineral exploration. So you'll see that next time. Tune in next time, I guess. And that's going to be submitted hopefully soon. And then paper 3 will put everything together. I'll take all of the engineered features from earlier work, supplement it with a few of the more traditional techniques, and then compare the two areas using machine learning, probably a supervised technique, to really understand, or at least identify what factors are present at either or both that control mineralization, and then hopefully be able to rank them and provide an uncertainty estimate with that. And hoping to submit soon in September, so clock's ticking. And thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Rebecca. Do we have any questions from the floor?
I'd like to ask a question, Ross.
Yeah, go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, very nice, Rebecca. I'm really glad that someone is applying some more robust approaches to defining these fields. And I wonder whether it's possible for you to build in a detection limit feature as well, because I think one of the big problems with ultramafics, especially when you're using niobium, is that a lot of the older data, and definitely a lot of the older XRF data, is certainly detection limit compromised. And even some of the ICP-MS data is. And so, I mean, for instance, you have the same problem with a lot of the early cerium star data on zircons, that the cerium anomaly is actually very largely a function of the poor detection, or the magnitude of it, of the poor detection limits of early quadrupole instruments. So I wonder whether there's a way of kind of flagging what analysis type there is, or because I think that is creating a lot of noise in the data as well, that is hard to account for the way that you're approaching it.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this subject. I did an entire directed study where I actually had to pull the ripcord on this rabbit hole. Otherwise, I could spend my entire PhD working on this and imputation techniques. Colin Barnett actually just released a really good paper. I can dig it out if you'd like to read it. And it deals with a lot of those lower detection limits and what to do to make sure that you're geologically reasonable, but also statistically reasonable when you're trying to fill in the blanks and I make those identifications of samples that are problems. When it comes to different techniques, I took great pains to recover as much metadata as possible from, I had like 20 or more sources, and that doesn't even count everything before the 1980s, which was just lumped together. But I did do a fair amount of investigation to make sure that the different techniques could be compared in a single database. And I've done my best to flag exactly what crushing apparatus was used, if there was any influence from that, any preparation or dissolution methods were used, and analyses as well. It's been quite extensive. If you'd like more info, I can show you some stuff later.
Yeah, I would, thanks. I mean, it is a real problem, and it's not helped by the fact that some of the early versions of software for laser ablation were not correctly calculating the detection limits either. And so you got these amazingly optimistic views of what data was real. So anyway, but I'm very glad you flagged the method types in your database.
Yeah, as an advocate for metadata, please always include lab reports when you release data. Please, always. It's so helpful and needed. Otherwise, the data can't be properly leveraged.
Okay. Thanks, Becky. Eric, you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments, actually. And one is that you hadn't really looked at the geochemical data from a compositional point of view. And so you're restricted to the positive number space. So any kind of statistics, and including things like principal component analysis, you introduce a bias by not taking a log ratio. So I don't know if you're familiar.
No, I certainly applied transformations.
You do. So you use the log-centered transformation?
Yes, I use the log-centered.
All right. Well, thank you for clarifying that, because it wasn't clear from your presentation. I'm glad you're doing that. The thing about detection limit issues, there are good statistical methods for compositional data to come up with replacement values to minimize bias in the statistics, and those should certainly be applied for any kind of further analysis. So
I looked at doing that because I had such a large database. I opted just to eliminate anything that had issues.
Right.
Perhaps
And-
I biased it a bit with sampling, but yeah.
Yeah, well, there's an additional complication when you're assembling data from many different sources. They're going to have many different detection limits, which creates some real headaches. So I can sympathize with that. And just one comment, we did a study on Archean classification of Archean volcanics, and that was published in the OGS 100th anniversary volume. That's the last paper in the volume that has a statistical classification of Archean volcanic rock. So you might want to refer to that.
Yeah, I would certainly love to read that.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Everyone, thanks very much.